So, has anybody ever watched a movie or a series, maybe one starring Ted Bundy, or have you listened to a viral podcast like Serial? Maybe you're just like me and your friends forced you to watch the new series for Army Hammer, who was a man that wanted to eat people, or maybe you don't watch anything at all. But with multiple streaming platforms like Spotify, YouTube, and Netflix, the world of true crime series is very large, and the chances are you have also fallen into the fascinating science behind the psychology of serial killers, which is mostly what true crime is giving us, right? The psychological and medical backgrounds of the perpetrators of these crimes. But what do you feel when you listen to these gory descriptions of often brutal and unusual murders? So, my name is Yasmin, and I am your host for episode 1 of Crimes of True Crime, aka True Crime Squared, where we evaluate the social and psychological impacts of true crime podcasts, docuseries, and movies alike. With the release of many stories of serial killers and murderers, it is also important to see why so many of us choose this as a source of entertainment, especially with the negative effects of true crime series, like inducing maybe copycat effects or the re-traumatizing of victims' families through series, as well as the subjugation of minorities and the propagating of the perfect victim complex, the anxiety it induces from its audience, and the continuation of violence as a spectacle, which after watching Jordan Peele's Nope really made me think about, why is violence a spectacle? USC professor Jasmine Tarani has been kind enough to join us today to talk about the true crimes of true crime. And thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your specializations, please, Professor?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Yasmin. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I think that's a great introduction and kind of a great setup for what today is going to be all about. So I have a PhD in clinical psychology from USC, and then I did a 2-year postdoc in forensic psychology at the USC Keck School of Medicine. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been working as a forensic psychologist in a variety of settings. So I started in the treatment side of the world, working in correctional institutions, working at Twin Towers, which is the largest psychiatric hospital in the country, but it's a jail with a severely mentally ill inmate population.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I've been working as an expert witness, where I get hired by attorneys and by judges to do forensic evaluations of defendants, evaluating things like competency to stand trial, insanity, dangerousness, so on and so forth. And then since 2006, I've been with the parole board, and I developed a program called the Forensic Assessment Division, where we do violence risk assessments, primarily on murderers to determine their risk of dangerousness to the community. But I think the professional hat that I wear, that I'm most proud of and that I really most enjoy, is that of being a professor. I've been an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the med school since 2001, and an adjunct professor in psychology in the psych department since 2005, teaching forensic psychology and criminal behavior. So I come from a variety of vantage points, and just happy to be here. Happy to be here today.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, as everybody heard, that's a very extensive portfolio. I don't know. I have an audience here actually, so they just heard a gigantic list of accomplishments, and just you definitely know your stuff when it comes to the forensics behind these crimes. And I believe your conversation with one of our producers, you said, well, I don't really listen to a lot of true crime because you're living it, right? You're seeing these stories play out in real time. So I guess, as a forensic psychologist, have you ever listened to a true crime podcast ever?
Not a true crime podcast. I have seen a few docuseries, documentaries. I certainly show a lot of documentaries in my
Mhm.
classes to really illustrate, the complex subject matter. But kind of as a rule of thumb for myself, I don't find that to be a source of escapism, like I think it might be for others.
Mhm.
And so I kind of gravitate towards, the more lighthearted.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, you made a really good point there. What, in your experience, how do you utilize like true crime, like docuseries in an educational form?
oh, sure. There are some wonderful, I think, very thoughtfully and responsibly produced documentaries that illustrate crime, violence, the nexus between substance use and crime, that have been published through PBS's Frontline
Mhm.
series. It shows both from the perspective of the perpetrator, also the victims, and the cost to society. So, I don't want to show things just purely for sensational value. I don't see any educational, value in doing so. But certainly, it kind of changes the pace of things, and it gives our students an opportunity to see how these things play out in the real world.
Yeah, so you kind of talked about the educational value of true crime docuseries when things are being produced responsibly. So I guess for the more sensational type of true crime docuseries, why do you think it's a popular genre amongst people? I guess just in your opinion.
Sure. So, when your producer first approached me on this, I thought, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. And I also just feel a real responsibility to make sure that the information that I share isn't just anecdotal or my own personal
Mhm.
opinion. I just did kind of a brief lit review on this to really kind of fully understand, um, you know, what is really driving this fascination, because it's not a recent phenomenon, just as you said, Yasmin. This, dates back to the ancient times, and so I think people have always been interested in crime and violence. I think some people have certain traits or predispositions that make them more likely to gravitate towards this genre and enjoy watching it, where they might be more of a thrill seeker, they may be more extroverted, they may be more sensation seeking. I think these folks in particular, tend to be able to watch the material and not take it home with them, or not have it lead to kind of a sense of hypervigilance when they're out in public, or having it lead to nightmares. I think, for others, it kind of gives them an opportunity to kind of learn vicariously, how to behave or what to happen if they're encountered by a predator, for
Mhm.
example, or just practicing how to regulate their own emotions when they're confronted by stressful stimuli. So one recent publication, peer-reviewed publication that I read, showed that those individuals who gravitate towards like morbid material, crime series, horror movies, that they tended to be more psychologically resilient during the pandemic than the rest of us,
Oh
because
wow.
they've been preparing for this kind of their whole life. How do you handle something that is traumatic and stressful? And there are these groups called preppers where they watch like pandemic type of films like Contagion, and it's been shown to help them to become more resilient, physically and psychologically. So I mean, my goodness, who knew that there was something adaptive?
Right, from listening to true crime podcasts. I mean, I guess for in a sense, that makes me feel a little bit better because my sisters, well, one of my sisters, she's a big true crime listener, and she would tell me how she would be working at Wendy's, one AirPod in, she was listening to a true crime podcast. She was on edge the whole time because she's like, man, like I'm really anxious because the things that they talk about are really gory, but it I can see how it can make her more resilient, in especially in terms of like we're in a pandemic and there's like lots of stuff happening, and I think she handled it really well. So I'm glad to hear that. I'm like that's one of the positive sides for me. I'm a little anxious, but that's so fascinating, right? To
Maybe it's because of the similarities in our names, in our first names. Because I'm with you. When I watch those, it's one thing to work as a forensic psychologist where we're not at the crime scene
Mhm,
seeing these gory images. I may have to look at autopsy pictures and photos, but it's from a distance and
mhm,
it's within limits. But that's different than watching something happening to a victim, watching them get tortured, seeing the aftermath, on the big screen. And we find that persons who are more empathic are the ones that don't tend to really gravitate towards towards this genre. So it also tells us something about ourselves as
mhm.
well.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like the majority of the ones that I have listened to just dive deep into like really graphic descriptions of how the violence was like carried out. And for me, I, I listened to one and that was my maximum, like at least for a podcast. The visual descriptors definitely a lot. I guess that leaves me to the next question is, um, what is your opinion on focusing on the psychological and medical background of serial killers compared to like their impacts of crime, because we do dive deep into the medicalization of the serial killers and and yeah, just like their background, where they came from, how they grew up. We focus a lot of that, but not necessarily how much their crimes have impacted their communities around them.
You know, the sense that I have is that it's natural for us to want to kind of zero in on the more extreme forms of violence, and serial killing is certainly on the very tail end
Hmm.
of, of that continuum. And, it's almost like murder in and of itself is not fascinating to us as a society anymore. It needs to be multiple murders and it needs to be, related to, serial
Mm.
killing. And I think it's just natural for us as humans to want to piece together that puzzle to figure out how this person became that way. But then you're right, what tends to get lost, in that understanding is the impact that it has had on society, on the victims, on the what we call VNOCs, which is victims next of kin. These are the survivors, who have left behind, who are left in ruins, by the acts of these perpetrators.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to so we talk about like victims' families. I want to know if you've kept up with any of like the articles that came out about uh the Jeffrey Dahmer's victims' families, in terms of they didn't really consent to having this story told once again, because there's multiple series about Jeffrey Dahmer. So do you know anything about the psychological impacts of families that do have like their family member as the center of attention of some other docu-series?
Right. They're almost, the victims, and they're, usually they're victims next of kin because the victim has been killed.
Mhm.
So it's the family members, they're sadly the collateral damage in all of this whenever docuseries come to light. I mean, I'm old enough to remember uh, the Dahmer case, and followed it, in undergrad. But, most of my students don't really know too much about it, but now they do. And
Mhm.
just imagine what that's like, for the victims to have to relive that. One of the things that I do with USC, and it's something that I do, pro bono, where USC has a division called USC Health and Society, where media outlets, producers and writers reach out to the Norman Lear group, and they hook them up with experts. And so if it's related to crime, violence, mental illness, sometimes they'll come to me. And I think most writers, most producers want to, do a really responsible job in their storytelling,
Mhm.
make it as accurate, as possible. And and in some cases they'll ask, well, what can we do to mitigate the risk of this storyline, when we're showing this to the public? Are there certain things that we should avoid? And I really appreciate those kinds of discussions. And I think for that Dahmer series, I haven't watched that on Netflix, but I have followed the aftermath
Mhm.
of it, and the victims next of kin who've come forward.
Yeah, I have also not watched it. Just also protesting, right? Protesting the consumption of media that has uh some negative impacts on people. Which I also wanted to ask. So when responsible journalists do come to you to ask, how do we tell stories responsibly? What are some of the answers that you give?
Some of it has to do with the dialogue and
Hmm.
the terminology, that we use, just wanting it to be factually correct, but also, uh, wanting it to be person centered and,
Hmm.
socially responsible. Um, when there's discussions regarding displaying just really gratuitous levels of violence, I mean, I understand they have a job to do and they have a vision that they wish to execute. But, what value does that have? I mean, there's been some research that shows that when they show these focus groups a scene, a part of a movie that includes extreme violence, and then another sequence where it's the same movie but without that extreme violence, people like the latter better. So it's not like it's adding much to the audience, to the audience experience.
Hmm. So there's, I guess, like for responsible storytelling, you have to sacrifice, like, maybe not getting your story to such a large audience, but maybe, I guess, maybe that's something that some of these podcast people need to take into account, right? Because I guess not everybody's going to like everything, and maybe you'll find like a niche group of people that'll listen to responsible storytelling and take that into account.
I think
Um,
there's something to be said about, leaving a little bit to the imagination. And,
mhm,
I do like watching some of these psychological thrillers.
mhm,
I think that, those are interesting, and they don't really show those extreme displays of violence or torture. But it doesn't make it any less scary, I think,
mhm.
for the audience. But it just isn't an assault to our senses.
Yes, I agree. I think that also just kind of segues into the large discussion of what type of violence or what type of psychological thrillers are we consuming as a society? Are we consuming it like responsibly, and are we taking like victims into account? So I think this is all very valuable information for all of us to know, in terms of being responsible about what we listen to, who we choose to support, and whose stories we are telling, or who is the person behind the storytelling as well, right? Most of the time, I think true crime podcasts focus on a white perpetrator, right? So most of the time, it's some white guy that is killing people. Um, And I don't know if you've seen this on the internet, but the the people that live on the internet are loving it. They're enjoying it. I don't know if you've ever watched or heard about the series You on Netflix. It is not necessarily a true crime docu series, but it has some true crime elements.
Character.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody was like, I love him. And he was like, you're not supposed to like me.
Well, he has, in fact, in my classes, we talk about some of these characters, and that is one show that I like. That is one show that I watch, and I think the common thread in
Mhm.
some of these shows is you see the display of psychopathic tendencies.
Mhm.
Psychopathic persons like the character portrayed by Joe, there is a likable quality to them. But then there's this really dark, dark side, this dark, obsessive side
Mhm.
that comes out in really kind of violent, grotesque ways.
Yeah, and what are your opinions about extending that same like likability traits to people that maybe don't deserve redemption? Like Jeffrey Dahmer is now the center of some attention for people online. I think they're giving him too much slack here. He's caused a lot of pain, but people are still. Do you believe that there's a certain level of like romanticization that comes with being so what is the word, it's what happened with Pablo Escobar, right? It's the notorious reputation that they gain kind of excuses them from um actual harm that's done to communities.
And perhaps like the same thing had happened in not just the life, but even in the death of Charles Manson. These people become larger than life. And, how did Jeffrey Dahmer die? It wasn't by his own hands. He was beat to death by a fellow inmate, in prison.
Hmm.
I think there is somewhat of a twisted fascination, with these kinds of characters and with these kinds of killers, I should say. I mean, these are not characters; these are actual real life individuals um, that could be to the detriment of the victims and the victims' next of kin.
Hmm. Yeah, and that leads us a little bit into our next question about the impacts of giving um, these people that committed murder like a spotlight even years after the actual crime happened.
So, for that individual, and because we find that they're these individuals, serial killers, are more likely to display higher levels of not just antisociality,
Hmm.
but also psychopathic traits.
Hmm.
Persons who are psychopathic, they like being in the limelight. They
Hmm.
like the attention. And, it's not just the attention that they get once they're caught and during the trial. It's, once they've made it to these docuseries, 10, 20, 30 years later, where their victims are having to really relive that trauma. So there is a reinforcing value to it. At the same time, and again, I want to be balanced,
Hmm.
because that's what we have to be as professors. We have to kind of look at everything from all angles. There is also, I think, an argument could be made that there's also a public service that's being done because, these people aren't just you know, born this way. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of look at the developmental pathways and the life experiences that have shaped this individual to become the way that they are. Not always, but oftentimes we find that, these individuals who have done horrible, horrible things have been victims of extreme childhood trauma and violence themselves. Not that it excuses what they've done, obviously,
Hmm.
but it helps to understand, where some of that level of violence was learned from, and, why they've been simmering and harboring, such anger and resentment, throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, and that does like give us like more insight as to how we operate like in our society, right? Like we listen about how people came to be, and like you said, it does give us like a life lesson of we should be kind to people no matter like what the circumstances are. I guess like a little bit of where you said obviously that doesn't excuse what these people have done, but do you think there's any like pattern as to who we are more willing to forgive, like in true crime podcasts? Is there, does that question make sense?
It does. It does, and I mean, it's such an individual thing, but I think as a society, we may be more likely to forget, not, well, to understand and show compassion for those who, have done things since their crime, since the murder. What have they done since then? Who are
Hmm.
they now? So we understand who they were then, but that may have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. What have they done in the interim? Have they tried to better themselves? Have they tried to make amends to the victim's family? Have they tried to, gain some self-awareness into why they committed this crime? Are they participating in rehabilitation, like meaningfully participating, not just kind of sitting in a chair, just to get someone's signature that they participated, in a program? So I think it's those kinds of things that are, within the individual's control, that we want to see, that
Hmm.
the public wants to see, what have you done? You can't erase the past. And most of these folks are going to be released at some point.
Hmm.
Most of them are going to be released, and so we have to ask ourselves as a society: Do we want to have an individual back in society who has meaningful access to rehabilitation while they're behind bars?
Hmm.
That when they come out, they have they're not the same person that they were when they went.
Hmm. Yeah, that those are fantastic answers as to like talking about the real life aspect of like what happens behind true crime, because these people, some of them are definitely still alive and they are serving time in jail and correctional facilities, and it makes us question the effectiveness of rehabilitation in these settings, and just how we are in general, like in our society, like how things came to happen. How are we handling it now moving forward, now that something has happened like in the past? And are we doing the most beneficial thing for our communities with the current tools that we have and the current systems that are in place? Whether or not these systems are effective, well, that's what I think a lot of activists are trying to question right now, right? Like, it's just, are these things working? Why do we still have these things popping up over and over again? Can there be something else that we can do to prevent these things from happening? I think we've learned so much. This has been so fascinating. Like, just to hear about all of the things that actually, these are all questions we were wondering while making the podcast, and it does warm my heart to see that there is responsible journalism that is happening. Um, does that mean all podcasts or all true crime series or docuseries, documentaries, all of them, are they all responsible? Maybe not, because they do play into the sensation of having a larger audience. But yeah, it's so, I'm very appreciative of your work. Like you said, you did some pro bono stuff for USC, and it's we're grateful.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank
Uh,
you so much, Professor Talani. Yeah. Oh, somebody asked, what class are you teaching next semester?
so in the fall, I teach criminal behavior,
Okay.
And then in the spring, I teach forensic psychology.
Forensic psychology. Are there any prerequisites to take these courses?
Say Psych 100,
I've taken Psych 100.
and I'm sure we're already full because they always cap me at a certain number. But I'd
For
be
all of the sophomores and the freshmen that are in here, take notes, y'all. Forensic psychology.
forensic psychology, yeah. And truth be told, I think between the two classes, I lean more so towards forensics. I do. I do.
Okay, yeah, and is there anything else that you would like to promote on this podcast? Any other maybe educational materials or any of your work that we can follow as well?
Oh my goodness. You know, I tell my students this: the best source of information related to criminal behavior and forensics is the LA Times. And so it's my understanding that at USC, we all get, a free subscription to the Times. And so that's where I draw a lot of my materials from,
Mm,
in my storytelling,
that is
my class. So yeah, you're paying for it already through tuition, so you might as well, take advantage.
of the LA Times. This is true. I did sign up for the free subscription to LA Times. I think I'm also subscribed to the New York Times because I needed an article for my Ratatouille essay. Um, but that's about it. Yeah, they were like, "Wow, Ratatouille is such a good movie," and I was like, tell me more, please."
So Yasmin, I'll tell you, I'm really happy that you're doing this podcast, and not that we had podcasts 20 years ago, but if we did, even when I look at my lecture materials from these classes that I taught 20 years ago to now,
Mhm.
things are so different, you know, and it's all driven by social and public policy. We're in a different era. Things are changing. I remember when I was coming up, this was in the 90s during the tough on crime era,
Mhm.
when we had three strikes and you're out, was first being passed in California and across the country. So, it'll be interesting to see what it's going to look like in 10 years, and I think much of it is really driven by all of you, the younger
Thank
generation,
you so much.
so passionate, about reform.
Yes, yeah, that's another thing. Just like reform and even like the complete changing of certain systems, right? Because some of them, well, I don't know. In my opinion, in my separate from this class, let me put the mic is over here. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about reforming some of these systems, but yeah, hopefully we are the young people of America, and we shall work towards a better future where we don't have to so we don't have that much material to make podcasts about, right? Like there's got to be a cap, right? Like how many murderers and serial killers are we going to have in our lifetime? I hope they run out.
I have to say, there is, sadly, from for society's sake, there is such job security in the work that I do. And and I say that with a heavy heart, because there's always going to be work.
Hmm.
There's always going to be work in forensics and in corrections.
Hmm. And that makes us like question again, just what are we doing now, and how can we
What are we doing?
work to prevent?
What are we doing?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in the ideal world, we should really be putting a lot of our resources on the front end in
Hmm.
education. And I don't mean just elementary. I'm talking preschool.
Hmm.
I'm talking giving families the wraparound services that they need, so that parents aren't working 4 or 5 jobs and kids, are kind of left unsupervised because their parents are just trying to work and make a living. And then
Hmm.
grow up and they gravitate towards another family source, which becomes the gang, and that leads them down a really dangerous path.
Man, and it just starts with how are we loving each other? For the people in the room that have kids, please give your kid a hug. I'm sorry. I have to say that. We have to give the kids a hug. Okay, well, I think that wraps up our time, but I appreciate the what is this called? there's the afterword, right? The afterword of the podcast interview. Thank you so much, Professor Tehrani. This was our first episode of the True Crimes of True Crime, aka True Crime Squared. I am your host. So I've been your host, Yasmin, and we had Professor Tehrani tell us about all the forensic psychology stuff behind true crimes. And yeah, thank you so much. I think that wraps it up. All right, so we had an eventful shoot with the psychology professor. I think we learned so much about the impacts of true crime on listeners, as well as like we got to learn a little bit about ourselves as to whether we do listen to true crime or watch any true crime docuseries, or if we don't watch any docuseries that involve any real life crimes. Just overall feelings about how you felt about what she was saying, because I know Brianna, you might have disagreed a little bit about what she was saying.
No, I like agreed on like what she was saying and the impact of true crime, but I'm like I don't know if it's gonna like deter people from watching anything.
Okay, yeah. So did it change any of your feelings about how you feel about true crime?
I mean, I do think it's like a detriment to like society, kind of, because it's like, for one, it's not beneficial to the victims and it really like impacts their families and stuff. And then also like, what are we actually gaining? I think that's the question. Is like, what are we actually gaining from learning about these true crime stories besides like just enjoyment and like knowing about this?
Mm-hmm.
But I think true crime is very interesting.
I guess like going off of that, do you think that there should be more value to true crime besides entertainment?
I mean, I think we should stop idolizing like serial killers and maybe flip it on its head and like talk about the more about the, instead of going into depths about their lives and everything, maybe going into depths of like the impact that they had on their victims and like maybe that part, because like the actual idolizations of serial killers is kind of harmful, I think.
I mean, it's kind of hard to talk about serial killers but not talk about what they did, but still talk about the impact that they had on their victims. Like we know, like for Jeffrey Dahmer, when he killed his victims, and then the families, they're like, stop talking about it. So I don't know how we can talk about true crime but at the same time not talk about true crime. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess like what the professor said so themselves was responsible storytelling would be like people first centered. So maybe you can get into the weird details. Like Brianna, you mentioned like the weird 70s and 80s, like right, the intricate details is what probably gets the user, or not the like, user, the person hooked into listening, right?
Yeah, because like if you think about the time around like when all of these serial killings were happening, like serial killers were pretty much running rampant. They're like the 70s and 80s, and it was like so many serial killings, and the police were not like catching them, or they were like releasing. It was because it's mostly white men, right? And so they're releasing them because they're like, oh, you know, maybe they didn't actually like kill someone at first, or they didn't have anything to hold them per se, and then they released them, and then they killed more people. And so it was just like so many serial killings back in like the 70s and 80s, and they were so like, I don't know, just like we were talking about the one who like they this man was killing someone who had the same letter in their first and last name, and that's such a like a detail to kill someone over. It's like so like, but it's interesting, and so I think that's why like true crime is so popular, is because it's like, why, like you're trying to figure like, why did that person do that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why did they kill them, and then how did the police not catch them?
Well, I feel like for the police, again, we're talking about the 70s, early 80s, where DNA testing wasn't as developed as it is now. And I feel like, let's talk about Ted Bundy, where he was not arrested, but stopped by police multiple times. And they didn't take him in for like booking, or like he wasn't arrested or anything. It's just like DUI stuff. So I don't think the police are like getting them, have this evidence, and it's like, okay, let's just let them go because it's not enough evidence. It was just, it's another regular white person drinking
But
and
then
driving.
They had enough evidence to book the black and brown people, though.
Oh man.
I mean, I don't know. Because I also studied the, like, serial killers, is it nature versus nurture in high school? I did my senior thesis on that, and like majority serial killers are white middle-aged men. So
Yeah.
I haven't really heard.
And that's something that it's like, we idolize them. Is it because like if they were black and brown, I don't think we would be idolizing them or like trying to learn their stories or all this stuff. It's because they are white men, I feel like. But I don't know.
I guess so. Like I think true crime I think is a legitimate source of entertainment just like anything else. I think what we wanted to explore was just the ethics of making it entertainment, right? Because it's like a very interesting story and we could read any fiction, like any fictional novel, and have some of the same elements that true crime has. And we're except this time we're not really concerned over particular like victims' families and re-traumatizing certain people, but except we totally are, right? Like I think the way that we tell stories in general has to be very done in a very responsible way, no matter if it happened to real life people or not, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we do need to like as storytellers or as people who are telling stories, make them aware or like trying to tell the responsible story, trying to make sure that you're being aware of the trauma that it can cause to like the victims' families and stuff like that, and that is not just a pure spectacle of entertainment.
Yeah, that's definitely like the checks and balances of listening to true crime. But even then, like Stacy said, you're still gonna be listening to a true crime podcast,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
after this, you're just gonna be like, let me
Like,
put one on.
I don't know. I feel like you get so desensitized to it. Not numb. I don't like using that word, but it's like you hear so much about it. I studied it I did a year-long research in high school, so it's not like a big thing for me anymore. Like that new serial killer that was in Stockton, I was like, okay, but
Please, why does that like not make you a little bit anxious like anymore?
I feel like it does make me anxious.
Okay.
Like when I hear about a new serial killer, I'm like, okay. And especially that they were targeting Hispanic people, I was like, okay.
Bro.
Like now it's like, kind of going to, I don't know. But I don't know. It's just, I learned too much about it where I'm like, they're sociopaths or whatever. Like,
yeah,
it's just different from our norm or what we know.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's almost like it's separate from your life. Like, you don't encounter serial killers all the time. So like when you hear about it, you're like, oh, that's something that happened.
But the thing is that like you totally can, like, you know what I'm saying? Like I feel like listening to true crime podcasts, anybody could be a serial killer. Like,
yeah,
but that's the thing. Like with serial killers, they go for years without getting caught. So yeah, you can be walking and you're walking next to a serial killer, you just don't know.
Yeah, wait, hold on. I have a question.
Okay.
If you were like taking the bus, public transportation somewhere, and the person next to you was a serial killer, would you want to know that?
Yeah.
You would?
Yeah.
That would make you start acting different. You know what I'm saying?
Obviously.
Yeah. I feel like there's like a certain level of like, I personally would not like to know. I would be like, okay, ignorance is bliss sometimes, and some people are just crazy and they're crazy all around you. And maybe because I don't know, then I won't be a target, but I will be prepared just in general. Like, I think it's nice to be prepared. Like the professor said, the people that do listen to like true crime podcasts or like watch docuseries were more resilient during the pandemic. Do you think this is true for you guys? Because I don't listen to that. So
not the pandemic.
Not the pandemic.
I feel like I'm definitely smarter. Oh my God. Smarter about.
So you're smarter than me?
No, but I feel like I'm smarter about like different things. So like I actually had this encounter like over the weekend where my dad's old friend from middle school messaged him randomly. Like they haven't talked in decades. And he's like, let's go to Apple Valley, middle of nowhere, and shoot guns. I told my dad, I'm like, no, that is some true crime
because you heard it
stuff.
from true crime.
You hear it from true
it's
crime,
like-
and you're like, no, I'm not gonna go with a stranger with guns in the middle of nowhere in the desert all day. No.
Oh,
That's-
So you get smarter about different
It's
situations.
like, but it's also like, I feel like
Brianna's like, that's just common sense.
I'm just
See,
like,
but it's not, because my mom, she was like, let's go, and I'm like, no,
I don't-
let's
I
think
feel
about
like,
this.
I feel like that's also cultural. Like, as a black person, like, there's no way I'm about to go into the middle of the forest or like in the middle of the desert with a stranger, or like even, I don't know, even someone I know. Like, I have like going into the middle of the forest,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
to shoot gun, or the desert to
She
shoot
just said the
guns.
Mexicans are crazy. She said
No,
y'all
like,
are out of
I
pocket.
feel like even like black and brown people, they just don't do that. Like, you like
Yeah, it's definitely weird. What was this guy's race? Is it another Mexican?
Yeah. Well, not
Oh,
Mexican.
man.
I don't know what he is. He's Hispanic, but he's a cop, so he does it for a living. So
okay,
I get
red
it.
flag, red flag.
I get it that it's like he also went to the military. He served in
Okay.
Afghanistan.
Maybe-
So like it's his hobby, but I'm like, you just don't text someone decades later and like, let's go shoot some guys.
Oh,
You
they're
know,
not
that's-
even. They don't even have like a report. It's just like a.
That's their fun thing to do.
And do you think because your mom did not listen to true crime, she
yeah,
would have gone?
Yes.
So would you
Yes.
encourage her to listen to some true crime podcasts?
Yes and no. She's just extra paranoid, which oddly she wasn't paranoid with that situation. It's so weird. It happened over the weekend. It was so weird, but
Okay, so you're just like,
Yeah.
you got to be more paranoid about
Yeah.
like serial killers and stuff like that?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
word.
Like, okay, let's
think-
say like Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy, they would pick up, like, I keep talking about them because I just know about them, but like if you're hitchhiking, why? You
That's-
know,
Yeah, it just, you do need to be aware.
aware. And
Like,
true
don't-
crime does that.
But
Don't
I think like
don't
being-
go outside at night alone. You know,
Walking in a street where there's like
Yeah,
no
in an alley.
lights.
like
I think
don't-
like being socialized as a woman, we're already taught that though. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's
Yeah.
definitely that, because there are so many men that will just rapidly kill women. It's like, I think we just
But I think that also, like, if you just look at even like the domestic violence rates, if you just look at like men are, I don't know, it's just have a more tendency to be violent
Yeah.
statistically, and so it's just like, as a woman, you're always like aware
On edge.
of
yeah.
like, you're like, oh, I don't want to like do this or do that because I don't know how like this person's gonna react, and so I feel like, I don't know, you don't want to be that true crime story.
yeah. Oh hell no.
But I feel like it's because we listen to it where we're like, okay, we need to be more aware of these situations. And like, I don't know, I'm not only with that. Like, I don't only think like that when I'm around men. It's like with anyone. Like,
Yeah.
Okay.
if you're inviting me to the desert, why? Like,
I
and
mean,
if
that's
it's
just,
if it's a
that's
group of
just
us,
insane. I don't want to be a true crime story. If I end up on a true crime story, somebody better kill my killer. What do you mean?
Okay,
It's an eye for an eye.
the last thing. Okay, is it okay if you're like to kill a serial killer
if I kill a serial killer,
or anyone?
if anyone kills a serial killer,
Is this
Yeah.
like pro death penalty? Is this what we're going? Okay.
Bruh.
If the evidence,
I don't.
Okay,
I don't know. I don't believe in eye and an eye. Just
I-
like not let it go, but let them serve their time. You don't need to kill them. You know
I
what I'm saying?
think they should go to rehabilitation.
That
Oh,
doesn't work. That
okay.
doesn't work. That
It doesn't work. Then
No.
kill them.
No.
I'm sorry.
Psychotherapy does not work on adults.
Okay,
It works
wait.
on children.
Is it like mental health? Like, is that like? I know that's an excuse, but is serial killing like that's a mental health issue, right?
Yeah, it can be childhood. It can be genetics.
Oh, okay, but like I was traumatized. I'm not out here killing people, right? Like, you know, I think yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. That's a tough question.
But that's another thing we'll talk about when we're talking about the
Nature
true
versus
crimes
nurture.
of true crime.
The true crimes of true crime. My name is Yasmin.
And Brianna,
Stacy.
thank you for listening to our rants.